Or put a different way, living on purpose.
Ask me.
Yes.
Some of you may have heard the story I'm going to be speaking from today if you've been along at this church long enough. I think it was about, 2016 that I gave a sermon. And so what this goes back to is my experience of my father's death. My father died February 7th, 2015 at the age of 89. An obituary statistic, but I want to reflect this morning on the meaning I made of my father's death, and more importantly, I want us to think about what that might say about life and the challenge it posed to me about being alive. So I'll tell you as it unfolded for me, with the emotional, physical, spiritual, existential dimensions of that, but I'm going to tell it a little differently from how the sermon went 8 or 9 years ago, because life goes on, and I've had to find my way back to living on purpose. At the time leading up to my father's death, he had done something that would not have been the smartest thing to do at my age, lifted something like a go-kart type thing he would ride around when that was not something good for his back. And so before Thanksgiving of 2014, I joined my mother and father in the duplex that they had in a retirement community to help them straighten out some things, work out some physical arrangements that might harmonize their relationship more effectively than sometimes happens when the person being cared for is grumpy and the person giving the care is anxious about it. So in that situation, it worked very well for me because I'd been a prolonged period of unemployment, and so it was not the best of seasons for me, and it felt great to be with my family and to feel helpful. But while there, before Christmas, my father indicated that if there were a switch on the wall that he could set every night when he went to bed about whether he would wake up or not, it would always be in the off position. And he indicated, at least between the lines, that he was seriously contemplating ending his life by no longer eating or drinking. So the situation was this. My father was in some pain, but nothing really chronic and nothing by any means unbearable. My father had COPD and needed oxygen to get around, but there was very little outwardly manifest, even inconvenience in his life. He was ambulatory, he could drive, he had social connections and other kinds of things, and he wasn't dying of anything. So when he announced, right after my mother's birthday, January 25th, he didn't want to do this during Christmas season, but he waited till right after my mother's birthday to say this was what he was going to do. I had a problem with it. I had a problem with it because I have worked in behavioral health. And I know that when people commit suicide and the state of mind in which they're doing that is not their most lucid self, that's a problem. My father was not his most lucid self. Dad's decision was in character, but how he decided had too much grumpy old man and not enough, this is how it's done, son. Dad's more valued way of deciding life had been reason over emotion, action over reaction, the greater good over immediate need. But he was clinically depressed. He had discontinued his medication because there were side effects he refused to talk about that he wasn't going to deal with. He had refused to explore alternatives. He was completely unbudging on any of the things that to me seemed consistent with what his earlier self in a rational mode would have at least explored with some deliberate intent. That's why I felt a duty to persuade him. No one should make such a momentous choice in such a compromised state. I should have done more. I should have made a stronger play to his lifelong curiosity. I should have somehow gotten him hooked on alluring pathways of the World Wide Web, because there's so much he could be fascinated by as someone who maintained that engineering interest in how things work and what people are capable of inventing. But he was depressed. He was not open to hope. He was irritable and in that sense no longer open to curiosity. He was aggravated, so he was reactive and not proactive. At the same time, and I want to be clear about this because this is important for anything anyone would take away from this sermon, especially as tomorrow begins Suicide Prevention Month. I knew that my father had earned this choice by his life, a privilege that no teen or young adult could claim, because the arc of my father's life had spanned well beyond his potential into years of living that he made actual with his choices, his commitments, his clear love for his family, among other things. And so my respect for my father's privilege to make that choice was not based on it being in any sense justified as a choice, either rationally or morally. I believe, looking back on it, if I had been a spouse rather than an offspring, if I had been a brother rather than a son, I would have fought my father on that. So part of it may have been the deference to a senior generation on which I have depended all my life. But I think underneath that, I knew what my father was deciding was also in a deeper character with the person that he had always been. And I suspect, especially now, more than I did then, that there was a whole lot of rational calculus that went into that he didn't share with me or with anyone else. I think he was aware of certain declines that my mother was experiencing that we hadn't seen yet. I think he was thinking about in this retirement community, what if Joe and I are at different levels of care? What happens to the needs of the family? What happens to the resources? He was a down-to-earth person who looked after those things for the family. And I think in an unspoken way, that was the rational calculus that underlay at least his rationalization for the decision that it looked to me he was making on terms that were driven by affect. So I appreciated the privilege and the arc of his life, but as I say, I didn't feel that it was justified. I felt that his decision was driven by the emotions of a compromised nervous system, emotions that undermine vitality, resiliency, and trust in life. So, it's interesting how I came to terms with my father's death, given that it was, in a way, his trust in life that was undermined. I was more angry than sad about my father's death. I heard over the phone I'd already gone back home. Excuse me. So when he informed me one night, I should say one evening, of what he was going to do, I got a few words out and he said, I'm going to do this and you can deal with it how you want, but I'm going to do this. So I stayed up all night writing an email and trying to put into words what my father in his prime would have told me if that was my idea. And that's kind of how I approached it. And I drew on certain things and I made the best case I could. And then in the morning, I called my father and I said, Dad, I've sent you an email. I'm not going to argue with you. It's your decision. I'm driving up there to be with you. And that was my immediate choice for my family, and I felt that it was absolutely right that I was going to be with my father. And so looking back on it, despite the fact that as a well-informed person working in behavioral health, I knew exactly how compromised that decision was. I aided and abetted my father in that sense. So in that process, after the phone call and driving up there, I was upset, as you can imagine. It's a pretty long drive up to Maryland. And I was speaking to a good friend over the phone, and I had an image of a little boy sitting at the dinner table with a few cold peas on the plate, saying, "Can't I just be done?" And that seemed to me so true that that's what broke through for me. I'm not saying that my father's life was the equivalent of a few cold peas. I don't think it was. I still didn't agree with him. But that attitude, "Can't I just be done?" is something I think all of us can relate to. So when I say that by my reckoning, my father had earned that privilege, that's what I'm speaking to. He's earned the privilege to leave the dinner table if he saw it as just a few cold peas. When I was almost home and driving right past, like within vision of the place where I spent most of my youth and junior high and high school years, there was a dead deer on the side of the road, just at the point that I was driving by the house that we'd shared much of our family years in. When I arrived at their house, the hospice team was there. Discussions were already underway, so you get a sense of where I was in that process. I assisted my father with the physical side of dying. The closer we get to the end, the more our bodies take over the demands of the day, right? And so I channeled my best friend who had done this with his father. I channeled my ex-wife, who's a hospice worker, and I said, okay, I can do this, and I did. The night before my father died, or the night in which he died in the morning, he had waved off morphine and then later accepted. He was peaceful at the time that he died, and I wasn't even quite sure when that was. In preparing for the memorial service, I reflected, my father was a non-practicing agnostic by his own profession. That's what he called himself. I am a non-practicing agnostic, which might mean that conceptually he didn't believe in God, but he had to kind of act sometimes like there was a faith he was going to draw on. In any case, I love the open-endedness, the irony, the humor of it. It was so characteristic of my father. And it struck me, as I'll get to it a little bit in the latter part of my talk today, that in some ways my father was the better existentialist than his philosopher son. Because his philosopher son, who loved Plato and Hinduism and Buddhism and could look at things as all connected across space and time, like a Jonathan Livingston Seagull in kind of the dimensionless Einsteinian God world or something, where is the urgency of our finitude in that? Where is the fierce urgency of now if all of infinity is connected together? Whereas my father, anyway, more on that later. His faith was in life. He had always loved life. So the irony for me is he was taking his life, but his character was still the same person that had always instilled in me a love of life. Whether it was whatever the undertaking, there was a spirit in that, the spirit that led him to get his pilot's license before he even could drive, that kind of thing. So what finally came to me as my meaning in understanding my father's choice was that the way that he loved life was that if he couldn't keep up his end of the bargain with life, then that life wasn't really a life worth living. So that perhaps, and I could be totally wrong about this, I didn't discuss it with him in those last days, but I think that it was the part of him that loved life the most, that was most ready to let go when life wasn't something he could love anymore. Love it or leave it, right? And so he would leave it when he could no longer love it with the fidelity that he brought in a lifelong way. Very, very rich understanding on my part, rich enough that it becomes the closing chapter in the book that I've been writing, since before his death, actually. So that deepened my appreciation to the point where I could not only respect his decision, but even in some way affirm it. I could imagine my father, as we walked out of the memorial service, I could imagine spiritual aerobatics on his part to the tune of I'll Fly Away that we were singing as we walked out. But when it came down to the ashes and ashes, I broke down and wept, that so many do. That's the main story. Ending with my father's peaceful death and me at peace with my father's death, but not really at peace with my life. At least not with the life that I've been living here in Florida before I went to Maryland, the life of unemployment and stagnation and, well, some of you have a sense of what those features might have involved. So now the Paul Harvey punchline. Some of you may be old enough to remember Paul Harvey. The other side of the story, the existential kick in the pants to me, was that in his dying, I was challenged to see if I could live my life as fully as he had chosen to end his, instead of drifting along. Could I be as resolute in choosing life as he had been in living it and then in choosing death? So that's where I was in the story back in 2015. I recognized Dad as a better existentialist than me because, in a way, the agnostic presses more juice out of life, since this is the only chance we have to taste what life has to offer. Like the tale of the person dying who reaches for that berry on the vine on the cliff. Do you know that one? Some existential parable, anyway. Very good one. My life's next chapter took me where I wanted to go, from unemployment to a job that suited my skills and experience, even a flourishing romantic relationship. I was well satisfied. So I ended my 2015 sermon this way. As I returned to my so-called normal life, I'm quoting now from the way I was wrapping up my sermon that many years ago. As I return to my so-called normal life, I can't say that I'm quite living by the insights I've shared with you this morning, but at least I see an urgency there I was blind to before. As I dive into my new work, I find myself enthusiastic, animated. Looking back on my first few weeks, I imagine people saw in my face the love of life I so often saw in my father's. I'm thankful for that, for his life, for mine, for the love in which those lives are joined. That was then. Yes, after Dad's life, am I done with this page? I don't remember. Yeah, I think I am. After Dad's death, I was feeling more alive. Back in the world, into the light, stirred by challenges and supported by opportunity, by community rather. I decided it was time to engage my full potential, to embrace what I could be in a world I'd always danced to compromise with because I never felt part of it, really. My therapeutic thing on a recent exercise when we did some EMDR was that the underlying belief I wanted to shuffle off was no one accepts me for who I really am. So that underlying sense of disconnection with the world was very much something that had shaped my adult life into a herky-jerky evasiveness, into a, oh, they took that away from me, but they can't make me do this kind of dance. So I was bent on being what I could be, on realizing my potential, on reaching the point where I could give my best. That was the course of self-therapy and other kinds of therapy in which I've been engaged ever since. We all know how plots thicken as they go. And we've surely learned that growth takes us through the dark on our way to the light, right? So to be committed to lifelong growth is to be willing to venture that darkness, to look into areas of ourselves that are uncomfortable, that are unresolved, that are certainly untidy. In my case, however true my compass, I had to map these intervening years as I made my way. I lost the feeling of life, or more accurately, I lost the sureness of that feeling of life that I was gaining as I was coming back into what felt my natural self after my father's death. So I am finding my way back now to a sure feeling of life, a way I've had to earn across terrain that therapists call mixed trauma. Life, bless its heart, has ingredients that can harm our ability to live, that can sap our vitality and even undermine us. That's what happened to my father. And I, in my especially later years, have also found myself sapped of resiliency, of vitality, not by tenure denials and denials of positions and things from decades and decades ago, but by those straws that break the camel's back when you're almost at retirement age and you get exactly the wrong CEO when you just had exactly the right one. That kind of thing. To feel alive, to feel your sense involved in, swept up in the life in which you're inevitably cast. To feel alive is vitality. Life is the process of living it. Life is doing, life is activity of a lived body, lived as in invested with meaning in an existential sense, but body, not just that I am embodied, but that I am bodying what I do and who I am into the world. At least while I'm here, if I want to be spiritual about it, I am this body. That means that my feeling for life is not just meanings, but molecules. Genes, epigenetics, hormones, neurotransmitters, gut biomes, the telomeres that hold the ends of our nerves literally together. In 2015, I read a book that had come out the previous year, Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, which I'm delighted to say is still on paperback bestseller lists. It is a masterful treatment by a real mensch of what trauma does and of how therapists or whatever can help us begin to recover that resiliency. It talks about the bodily dimension, the cognitive dimension, the social dimensions of everything that's going on with that. And it blew my mind because I had a deeper appreciation for why I couldn't make the changes that I ought to be able to make. Why I was still doing this thing I've been doing all my life. That wasn't just, as I might have suspected at a younger age, ADHD, but a whole complex of things that were in my body. My central nervous system was doing things without my permission because it had been geared that way. And that's what I set out to find a way around. That's what I've set out to be working through in my various forms of therapy. In doing that, it's been a work for me to restore my resiliency, to free my inner child or my inner energetic child from the grumpy old man in me that always wants to steer. Before, I said that Dad didn't want to live if he couldn't keep up his end of the bargain. But now I can hear life like a character. Imagine the love of life that I spoke of on my father's part. Now imagine that love is a relationship, and the other character besides my dad is life personified, capital L. And I can imagine life challenging my father and asking him, "Are you done so soon? Is that all you've got? Which surely my philosopher Nietzsche, with his true insistence on affirmation of life is the most important thing, would articulate far better than I could. But we do, I believe, have a relationship with life. Life is always mine, but it is not only me. That's an existential truth. Viktor Frankl was aware that we need to make meaning of our life. Without a sense of meaning in our lives, we may lack the will to live, as my father came to. Again, in this existential sense, yes, I am always in my life, always in media res, but myself or ego isn't the whole of my life. So roughly, there's the living me, and then there's my lived world, and together, in relationship always, that's my life. That is a relationship. At best, my world is an inviting world. There are different degrees of that, but this is kind of site appropriate as we're here near the river anyway, that if we follow the water a little farther. I like to body surf. And at some point in my practice of that, I realized that the key feature for whether I should take the next wave was not what the next wave looked like, but how the last wave felt. That the way the tides go, that pull that I would feel from what was gone in and then would be the same thing driving what was coming in. So to feel that pull, to feel pulled by my life forward into doing, that's the feeling I want. When I have that feeling, I am on. I may walk away from something, lose that feeling, and then I said I would do what? But when I'm on, right? And so I love that analogy because life engages us in a tidal way and because there are rhythms and ebbs and flows in that. But we are in our life the way that we are in the waves when we're body surfing. And that's what I felt so keenly right after Dad's death, the pull of my life, when we are not feeling it. And that's what I want to end on today. Perhaps sometimes what we need is a will to live, or at least the clear and determined intention to live actively, rather than just be alive in a passive sense. As one of my philosopher kings put it, Bob Dylan, he not busy being born is busy dying. You may have heard that one. So, how is my relationship with life? I once had a romantic partner too conflicted in her own life to give or receive what love required. Am I too conflicted to truly love my life? Or am I all in? If we are honest with ourselves, we know, and if we are willing, we can look. Because it shows in the living. It's not some hidden quality. As Jean-Paul Sartre remarked in his existential métier, you are your life and nothing more. We may debate the nothing more part metaphysically, but not in terms of the living of it. Am I all in with life? A million moments, a million meanings, trillions of cellular alignments go into this. Is my love of life as strong as I felt it in green youth, or am I settling for this is enough? Am I even lowering the bar, maybe just a little bit with each passing year? How does it stand with life? On the positive side, I may feel life is good. Life is satisfying. I'm happy. Very differently, I may feel, in spite of the fact that I'm not satisfied or happy, I'm engaged, I'm active, what I'm doing has meaning to me. I have a full life, and that's worth living. Or again, on a different version of the positive side, I may be determined and persistent. I may insist that I am the captain of my soul, that I am the driver of my life. You may call me a fighter, You may say, God, he's in a bad place, but look at how he's carrying on. I want to say all three of those spirits, each different, is a way of being all in with life, depending on our circumstances and what else we bring to it. On the negative side, the philosopher Nietzsche, who held the affirmation of life above all, at the very opposite end of his valuation was ressentiment. To take revenge against life, to say life is not what it should be. My life isn't what it should be, because to be resentful because life isn't what it should be. Which relates to the whole Buddhist analysis of expectation and attachment and those kinds of things with respect to suffering and with respect to all that follows from that. But if we live in a way that's resentful, if we live in a way that's resigned, and I mean by this kind of resigned, not genuine acceptance, but like, I guess that's all it's going to be. I guess there's nothing I can do about it. If we allow cynicism, that would be the opposite of an affirmation. So, in my intention to affirm life, I'm looking at the actual living. I'm looking at the places where I get fed up with customer service of Comcast or somebody. I'm looking at the places where, why won't my TV do what this thing said I would do when I paid for that thing? I'm looking at all the ways in which I get activated and reactive in a way that shuts me down, in a way that pulls me back from life, in a way that brings out not the best in me that can figure out a way forth, but the worst in me that says it's not even worth it. That's what I try to overcome. The essential thing, I may not be able to live in a state of flow. I may not be able to be mindful all the time. I'm not talking fairy tale unicorn poop. But can I intentionally, and then with attention, set myself on that essential thing that I give at least a tacit yes. It doesn't have to be out loud, but underneath everything I'm doing, there's a yes to life. Can I do that? For a spiritual person like me, this can be harder because I don't feel all the way at home in this world a lot of the time. So I have something I want to share that I just picked up last week for those of you who may be spiritually inclined. There's a book that many people read when they're 10 years old or something, that the Washington Post reviewer of children's books raved about because she was just picking it up as an adult. It's called Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt. Have any of you read it? One or two familiar with it? It's kind of a fairy tale. It's sort of a simplified Charlotte's Web, Wrinkle in Time kind of reading level thing. But there's a magic spring that people that drink from it are immortal. They live forever. And there's a very ordinary family called the Tucks who did that. And so in the course of getting together every 10 years, they connect with the little girl who lives in the house that owns the forest, that has the spring that they're hiding, and the little girl finds out what's going on. And so the plot revolves around, oh my God, what do we do? How do we keep people from finding out? And for the little girl, if you had the choice, would you be immortal or not? But I'm coming back to what the opening words were. Look well, therefore, to this day. Or as May Tuck puts it in the book Tuck Everlasting, life's got to be lived, no matter how long or short. So whether you're an atheist, an agnostic, a spiritualist, whatever, no matter, look well, therefore, to this day. Thank you.